The second kind of credit transaction or the second contract under credit transactions is the contract of deposit. Now, I'm sure when you hear of the word deposit, what comes to your mind is your bank accounts, diba? Now, please do not get confused because your bank deposits or your bank accounts where you deposit your money for your savings, that is actually not a contract of deposit as defined under the credit transactions. In fact, your bank accounts is a contract of loan, particularly mutuum or simple loan. Did you ever wonder why the bank gives you interest income? Nga naman naaman mo yung interest income? That is because the banks use your money. Ba? Kanang ilang mga gipang-offer nga mga nagkalain-lain nga loans, inyuha ng kwarta ang ilahang gigamit. And in return for allowing the bank to use your money, munang tagaan kanila og share out of their profits or out of their income in the form of the interest that you earn out of your savings kintahay diha sa ilahang bangko. But that is not really a deposit as defined in Article 1962, but rather it is a contract of simple loan or mutuum whereby you transfer the ownership of your money to the bank so that the bank may be allowed to use your money, to consume your money with the obligation of returning your money in the same amount, plus of course with interest lang hinuon. Okay, so that is the nature of bank deposits. What is then a contract of deposit mandiay as a credit transaction? So let's go by Article 1962, which defines a contract of deposit as one constituted from the moment a person referring to the depositary reserves a thing belonging to another with the obligation of safely keeping it and returning the same. Okay? Thus, the object or the purpose of a contract of deposit as a credit transaction, guys, is the safekeeping of the object deposited. So, kanang inyong bank deposits, kanang inyong savings account with the bank, that the money you give to the bank is not being safe kept by the bank because they use it, they consume it. Mo nang mutuum siya. Because ang contract of deposit, the purpose or the intention of the parties is the safekeeping of the object or the preservation of the object. Thus, in Article 1962, the law further provides that if the safekeeping of the property is not the principal purpose of the contract, then it is not a contract of deposit but a different kind of contract. So mauna, kanang inyong mga savings again sa bangko, that is not a contract of deposit but rather it is a contract of loan, specifically a mutuum or a simple loan. Okay, so what are the characteristics of a contract of deposit, guys? So a contract of deposit is also a real contract, same as in a contract of loan, wherein the delivery of the object purported to be safe kept or to be preserved by the depositary is a requirement for the perfection of the contract. A contract of deposit may be a unilateral contract or a bilateral contract, depends on how many parties are bound to perform obligations. So if it is a unilateral contract, if it is a gratuitous contract, then it is unilateral. But if it is an onerous contract, then it is a bilateral contract. In 1963, this emphasizes the nature of a contract of deposit is a real contract, that the agreement of the parties does not bind the both of them because the perfection of the contract comes after the delivery of the object. The delivery being an essential requisite for the perfection of the contract. What are the different kinds of deposit? In 1964, we have judicial deposit, we have extrajudicial deposit, and then the extrajudicial may be voluntary or a necessary deposit. Okay? 1965, a deposit is a gratuitous contract as a general rule, but as an exception when the parties agree for it to be onerous, then it becomes a bilateral contract. The object of a contract of deposit, guys, in 1966, as a rule, are movable things. Movable, okay? Can be easily transferred from one hand to another. Ma-move nimo from one place to another. That is because of the requisite of the delivery for the preservation of the object. But as an exception to this, in judicial deposits, immovable properties or real properties may be the object of the contract. Okay? 1967, well, this only gives us the two kinds of extrajudicial deposit, voluntary and necessary. Right, so let's go to the specific kinds of deposit. Let's have first voluntary deposit. So what is a voluntary deposit? A voluntary deposit, guys, literally is one which is created or perfected by the voluntary act of the depositor by his delivery of the object to the depositary by his own will. Okay, so a voluntary deposit is that wherein the delivery is made by the will of the depositor, and it may be made by two or more persons, each of whom believes that he is himself is entitled to the object or to the property. The second, the second sentence of 1968, guys, is katong sa interpleader. If you were under me in obligations and contracts, I already have discussed this, ang interpleader. Or even in the interpleader in obligations and contracts, yun din ako na discuss. Okay? An interpleader is a case wherein the person files a case bringing the claimants na daghang nangangkon. So para di siya maglibog o para di siya mag-struggle o kinsa iyahang tagaan sa object, iyaha silang dalhon sa court and let the parties present their claims to the court and let the court decide kung kinsa gyud ang rightful claimant nila. And in the meantime, the person who filed the interpleader deposits the property to the court para ma-relieve siya sa burden na magsigpaningin niya, na magsig claim sa iya, adto na niya i-deposit sa court, and then it will be the court who will release it to the rightful claimant after the claimants have lawfully proven their claims over the property already. Okay? 1969, the form of the contract of deposit, it may be entered into orally or in writing. It does not matter, guys. What is important is that there is a delivery of the object. A contract of deposit, being a contract, it therefore requires the capacity of both parties. So what happens if one of the parties is incapacitated? So in Article 1970, if the depositary is capacitated and the depositor is incapacitated, then the depositary is subject to all the obligations of a depositary, but he will return the property to the legal representative of the incapacitated depositor. So he will exert efforts, diligent efforts to locate a legal representative and return the object, considering that the contract was not validly entered into because the depositor is incapacitated. Now, if ever the party incapacitated is the depositary, ang katong gihatagan, okay? Then the depositary has the obligation to return also to the depositor. However, if because the depositary is incapacitated, let's say he was already able to dispose of the properties, then he will pay the depositor the amount but by which he may have benefited. Kung di na niya mauli, then he will return the value up to the extent of his benefit, the advantage that he enjoyed. The third person, katong nakakuha sa property, if he is in good faith, then he will not be bound to return the object. Okay? Take note, good faith is preferred or is given credit by our laws. But if the third person is in bad faith, then he will be required to return the object to the depositor. Okay? Obligations of the parties, guys, starting with the depositary. So the obligation of the depositary is to exercise the ordinary diligence or the diligence of a good father of a family, considering that he has to preserve. I mean, the purpose or the main intention of the contract of deposit is to preserve the property so that he will be able to return the same object in as much as possible, the same condition when it was delivered to him. But if the parties agreed on a different degree of care, especially when it is an onerous contract of deposit, then he will be bound to observe such degree of care as agreed upon. In the absence of an agreement, again, he is only bound to perform ordinary diligence or the diligence of a good father of a family. Okay? If there is loss of the object, guys, if the loss is due to a fortuitous event, he is not liable. Remember, our basic premise is Article 1174. Fortuitous event extinguishes the obligation of the obligor. But if there is loss through the fault or negligence of the depositary, then he is liable for damages. He's liable for damages, of course, because there's breach of obligation. Okay? As to the return of the object, guys, as a general rule, subject, of course, to the demand of the depositor. Now, if the parties agreed on a specific date or a specific duration, and the depositor demanded for the return even before the lapse of that specific date, the depositary has to return the object to the depositor. But of course, if this is onerous, I mean, there's payment of on the part of the depositor, the depositary may require for the payment for the services rendered before there's return of the object. Okay? 1973, the obligation not to transfer the deposit unless there is an express stipulation to that. Because, I mean, do not give it to another person, considering, guys, that in a contract of deposit, there's also trust and confidence involved between the parties, that the depositor trusts the depositary. That is why the depositary was the one chosen to preserve or safekeep the property. So do not give it to another person, otherwise you will be liable for breach of obligation, and the fault or negligence of the third person, you will be liable for that. Okay? The obligation also not to change the manner or the way of deposit, because that is part of your agreement unless necessary under the circumstances. Okay? Kung needed yun kaayo, then allowed. But if it's not, needed for the continuous preservation of the property, then you have to justify it. But if it's not needed for the preservation of the property, you may be liable for a breach of obligation. Okay? Obligation to collect interest on truces in action deposited if you hold documents evidencing credits and these documents earn interest or there are income out of it, then you are also bound to collect them on behalf of the depositor. If the object of the deposit is fungible objects, so in 1976, you are not to commingle them. Okay? Ayaw i-commingle. Okay? If you commingle them, that will result to co-ownership between the owners of the grains or fungible property. So you separate them unless allowed by the nature of the object or unless allowed by agreement of the parties. Use of the thing, guys, the depositary cannot do that because, well, this is not a loan for use. This is not a comodatum, but this is for the preservation or the safekeeping of the property. The use of the object is only allowed if such use is necessary for the preservation of the object, okay? Or even if there's permission given, the permission must be, the use of that object must be limited to the scope of the permission given or the authority given and for purposes of preservation. Okay? As to loss in 1979, if there's loss of the object, you will be liable if there is there's agreement, there's use without depositor's permission, there's a delay in the return, and if there's use allowance for the usage, but you use it for a different purpose or a different intention. Okay? 1981 and 1982, if the deposited things are closed or sealed, do not open them unless the opening is required under law or by a court decree or necessary for preservation only in those instances. Otherwise, it has to be retained, closed, and sealed. Okay? 1983, the thing deposited must be returned together with its products, accessories, and accessions. If there are accessories, accessions, fruits obtained while in the deposit, they will be given back also to the depositor because the accessory follows the principal. Okay? The depositor, guys, need not prove the ownership over the property because anyway, there's no transfer of ownership. Okay? There's only preservation. But if the depositary is aware or has knowledge that the depositor is not the rightful owner, what he can do is simply to make a report to the authorities. Police. At tos police mag-report. Eh, but dili siya kinahanglan mag-require nga tag-iyabag yun si depositor or not. 1985, where there are two or more depositors not solidarily bound and the thing admits of division, then each one cannot demand more than his share. So joint liability, jointly deposited, so you can ask for return only of your share, respective share. Okay? 1986, person to whom return must be made to the depositor himself, or to the heirs, successors in interest, or to the person who may have been designated in the contract. Well, basic or good kayo ni sila nga mga rules. Place of return, as agreed upon, in the absence of stipulation, the place where the thing deposited might be at, if it should not be the same place where the original deposit was made. Time for the return, guys, the depositor can demand for the return of the thing at will or even if there is a time agreed upon. Okay? But if ever again there is payment for the services rendered, so maningil usa before i-uli. Okay? 1989, the right of the depositary to return the thing deposited. If it is gratuitous, then he can ask for the return at any time or, yes, at any time at will. But if it is for a valuable consideration after payment of the services rendered by the depositary. 1990, if the depositary by force majeure or government order loses the thing and receives money or another thing in its place, then what he will return to the depositor is the money. Like in the case of kanang mga unsa na gikuha sa government, like eminent domain. Okay? 1991, alienation in good faith by depositary's heir. So, the depositary's heir who in good faith may have sold the thing which he did not know was deposited, then he shall only be bound to return the value or the money received by it. Obligations of the depositor. If it is gratuitous, then he will reimburse the depositary for the expenses that the depositary might have incurred for the preservation of the thing deposited. The depositor shall also reimburse the depositary for any loss arising from the character and the nature of the deposit, because even though the depositary is bound to preserve that object, but it does not mean that it will also be at the expense or at the damage or to the prejudice, damage, or injury of the depositary. So the depositor is liable to pay for whatever damage caused to the depositary. The depositary may retain the thing in pledge until full payment for the services rendered. So this is what I have been saying earlier. If it is onerous, ay sa iuli kung dili pa ka mabayaran for your services rendered. How do you extinguish the deposit, guys? By loss or destruction of the thing, kung sa pa may i-preserve kung nawa na. If granting that the loss is due to a fortuitous event, no liability on the part of the depositary. Okay? In case of gratuitous deposit, upon the death of either the depositor or the depositary. Okay, so that is voluntary deposit.